Okay. Okay,
Okay, so
Alexis.
yeah. So what I kind of gathered from the first lesson is I took it I couldn't tell where it was going when it was talking about capitalism and such, but I was wondering if the kind of message or takeaway you wanted from it was that like we also have to think about natural resources and conservation like in a more economic way as well because like today a lot of people want sustainability and they want to make policies and stuff that prevent businesses from doing certain things that aren't like good for the environment and stuff like that, but like the divide is where people aren't thinking about how those policies affect things economically, and like this also gave an example of like the tragedy of the commons, um and how certain like regulations on fishing affected it. So is that kind of like where you're getting where you're going with it? Does that make sense?
Yeah. There's often a false dichotomy between use of a resource and conservation of a resource. And the term conservation is should be differentiated between preservation, in that conservation, the, the the philosophy of conservation is not to completely protect or preserve a resource so that it's not utilized for the purpose that human beings need it. The idea is that we would use it for the greatest possible good, and hopefully so it would be sustained, and so that it wouldn't be lost in depletion. So I bring about these. I introduce things like capitalism because, number one, a lot of students, just as yourself, I think, arrive at this class with an idea that capitalism is all about exploitation and um, dominance over the poor, or perhaps um, uh, snatching something up as quickly as possible.
Hmm.
While another thing that people bring to this class is that regulation is always good, and I'm here to say that it's often the case that government and regulation is not always looking out for the best interests of the
Right.
resource.
They have no incentive to.
Um, and another thing that most people may not recognize or may not appreciate is that a market economy, by its very nature, if it is a
True.
true market economy,
Free
okay,
market.
without distortions, without many distortions, will often adjust so that the resource is protected. And so, there are two ways of seeing this. You can envision government as benevolent and seeking to preserve or conserve a natural resource. That's typically what happens. But of course, we have the problem of unintended consequences, as you see with things like the Endangered Species Act. You know that when policies are actually put into effect, that they have not so good consequences. In fact, the consequences could be entirely opposite of what their intentions were. And the other side of that is in a market economy where you have prices and where you have uh, fewer distortions, a true market economy will tend toward a utilization of a resource in the most efficient manner.
Hmm.
And so in the most efficient manner with a strong, healthy system of innovations.
Hmm.
So innovation comes about through individual incentive, which is supported through a market economy.
Hmm.
Now, if you want to look at a centrally planned economy like the old Soviet Union, the Soviet Union could command whatever it wanted to
Hmm.
based on policy, but the the problem with a command economy is that there's no possible way that all the decisions that would ever be needed to create a policy that would be efficient or perfect could ever be known. And the market economy is one that allows individuals to make decisions without having to know everything about everything.
Mm-hmm.
So, in a market economy, the most important piece of information is a price. Prices are set by things that no one individual or even committee or even agency could possibly know.
Mm-hmm.
It's impossible. It's way too much information. So a price is all about understanding a value and establishing a value. So that's why I introduced these things early on in the course. Is I want you to remember that an example of the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons is a central issue with conservation, and it affects all sorts of natural resources.
Mm-hmm.
But the tragedy of the commons is an example of how human behavior can absolutely go against human initiative or absolutely against human wants and needs. So without the ability to identify property as personal property, or without the ability to control the resource, then you have this problem that arises where even though people realize they're doing bad, they do it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And they have to exploit a resource as rapidly as possible, even though they realize that doing so is going to eventually destroy the resource. Okay. There are other things that I want you to pick up in the first lesson, and that is things like the idea of the idea of renewable resources and non-renewable resources, and how those two types of resources are sort of misleading. We know that a renewable resource, right? I also say something about perpetual resources. Now, perpetual resources like the sun and solar power, generally not much of an issue. We're not going to lose those. Wind power, we're not going to lose wind power. But a renewable resource, such as a marine fishery or soil, great example is soil. A renewable resource has to be managed and has to have some checks on it, either through government policy or through private property rights, and I prefer the latter. Those controls over use
Mm-hmm.
on the renewable resource are often inefficient, or they're not capable of being skirted by ingenious humans. Okay, and the other side of that is that it's renewable resources that are typically the ones that are overexploited. Okay? And the non-renewable resources, coal, natural gas, petroleum, you name it. The non-renewable resources, mineral, I guess we could count some of the more important strategic minerals. Those non-renewable resources are usually the ones that never get depleted, never actually get depleted. And in fact, even though we call them non-renewable resources, we assume that they exist in a static or a finite amount. It's those non-renewable resources that, because of their price, stimulate innovation that allows the expansion of them, the expansion of their access or their volume or their actual amount, or they, because of the price, they expand innovation to replace them. And so if it's not for the, if it weren't for the idea that the resource was capable of being lost, we probably wouldn't have innovations for that. Let me give you an example of how that's really bad, okay? Or at least in my estimation. The United States has a policy, the federal government has a policy of subsidizing corn farmers in Iowa by producing, by establishing a way for alcohol to be added to gasoline as an additive. And so what that does is, of course, pushes the price of 10% ethyl alcohol gasoline down at the cost of you and me at government expense. But it keeps Iowa corn farmers and Nebraska corn farmers in business. Now, is that fair? I don't think it's fair because I don't grow corn. I think the corn farmers like it. The petroleum industry doesn't necessarily like it, especially right now. But there's to produce corn requires diesel, requires energy. But there are often political reasons for these things. They're often very economically irrational in terms of conservation of resources, very irrational policies put into place with the whole idea that everybody's benefiting.
Right.
So these are the things that I want you to think about, okay, in this course. The conservation, number one, conservation is not preservation.
Right.
Conservation is requires or is by definition involves the utilization of resources. It's just how they're utilized. And what we're seeking is the most efficient utilization of the resource possible. And that efficiency is a matter of some debate. And I don't necessarily care which one you leave the course with. I just want you to be exposed to the idea that markets, in the way that they're supposed to function, markets will typically work toward the greater efficiency of resource utilization. And if you can create a very efficient way of utilizing the resource, then and also encourage innovation, you may be saving the resource in a preservation sense in the long run.
Do you kind of think like with electric cars, do you think that's kind of an example of how the resource is being changed?
Well, it's a start. There's only one problem with most electric cars. Where does the electricity come from? Now, if you live on the Great Plains, the Southern Great Plains, like I do, near enough. I'd like to move to the True Plains, but if you are in an area where wind power is the predominant form, wind and solar power are the predominant forms of electricity generation, and they're not anywhere. They're typically a small portion of the total. I'm running this computer and this lamp here in my studio with electricity coming out of a power line that is ultimately connected to a coal-fired power plant about 25-30 miles to my north. And or it could possibly be coming from another part of the grid, which is a little more localized, a natural gas-fired power plant here in the town of Stillwater. Either way, most of the electricity I'm utilizing, except for maybe some that is purchased through OG&E from wind power stations out west that are also feeding into the grid, maybe 10% or something like that. Vast majority of the power that I'm utilizing is coming ultimately from polluting non-renewable resources, right? So just keep that in mind. If what's the ultimate source of that electricity? And by the way, I think personally, I would never have an electric car. Maybe a hybrid, but never an electric car, because all you're doing with an electric car is charging up a battery, and a battery is a horrible way to move power, because you're losing a very large share of the total amount of energy that it requires to charge that battery.
Mm-hmm.
They may not be polluting, but yet ultimately somebody's, there is some pollution somewhere. Yeah, there's pollution somewhere, and then you have the whole issue of disposal of the batteries and so
Right.
So where would it make the most sense to have electric cars? Well, that's not so difficult. It would make sense to have electric cars if you're charging those batteries with energy that's created in a clean way. And where can you find that? Well, you can find it with hydropower in the Pacific Northwest. You can find it with nuclear power throughout much of Europe and parts of the United States. I'm a big advocate of nuclear power.
Yeah, and then they took it away.
They took it away because of political reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Because of political reasons. But it's actually one of the very safest forms of power generation.
Right.
Definitely the cleanest. One of the cleanest. Well, of course, except for Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island.
Yeah.
There you go. The Russians, the Soviets, not the Russians, but the Soviets were in charge of the power generation. You didn't have a free market. You had command and control.
Right.
So, or another one would be something like hydrothermal or geothermal, excuse me, geothermal power in places like Iceland. Okay. Mm-hmm. Wind power in the Southern Great Plains. So wherever you have these you have a large amount of availability of clean, sustainable power. Problem is, it's hard to move the power around. So as long as we're not, as long as we're still using coal-fired power plants, generally, electric cars just don't make a lot of sense to me.
Right.
Bicycles make a lot of sense. All right.
Yeah, well, that clears up a lot of kind of like what I was trying to get.
Well, I have no intention of forcing your nose into one side or the other politically. I just want you to be aware of how markets can be utilized if they're allowed to work.
Right.
The problem is, even in the United States, a country we think of as quite free market, politics always comes into it, and we see that with corn subsidies. Mm-hmm. We see it with, oh my gosh, we see it with the food processing industry, where the things like pork production gets subsidized by cheap water, in the high plains. You'll see that when you get into agriculture a little bit. Well, I hope I didn't just talk all over your question.
No, you're good. And I'm glad that you're kind of taking this class in that direction, because a lot of classes like this, I feel like, have been very much the other direction. And this is kind of a conversation I've had with a lot of my peers too. And I feel like a lot of people I've talked to don't really seem to understand like how important some of the free market is in conservation. And I think a lot of people do get mixed up on what preservation and conservation is. So I think it's important that you're kind of making that difference more clear and giving the other side of it, because as I said, I think in conservation, this side isn't really talked about as much as I think it should be.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Not everybody will buy into that. Not everybody will have your perspective. And this class is not called environmental preservation. If it were, it wouldn't be a problem. I've actually worked in a field for over 20 years, that's known as historic preservation. Historic preservation, where we take old buildings and old homes and try to make them historically accurate, or at least try to bring them back to an historical sense, so that they're aesthetically pleasing. And some of that can be done. Some of that can even lead to some conservation. However, most old homes and most old buildings are never going to be as energy efficient, or just as energy efficient as something that's new. And the other side, even though the older building may be constructed with high quality materials, the newer buildings are typically built with a certain lifespan in mind, maybe 20, 30 years at the most, with the idea that those are going to be torn down and replaced with something new. So in historic preservation, the incentive is to preserve that historical look, or that historical ambiance. And one of the trade-offs is that you're going to have a less energy efficient building, or maybe a less a building that is not as accessible to people that might have physical disabilities. Okay, so there are big trade-offs there. And that, in fact, I got out of historic preservation because of the rigidity of government regulations and policies that stepped on private property rights.
Right.
And private property rights then are another facet of the preservation movement, historic preservation movement, because individual property rights are one thing, but to retain a look of an entire neighborhood, for example, requires that individual property rights be compromised a little bit to the whole, to the community. So anyway, that's just a little bit of perspective. Preservation and conservation are not the same thing.
Right.
Sustainability is always a good goal, but it's kind of how do you enforce sustainability? I think you can't legislate sustainability. I think you have to give people individual incentives to act sustainably.
Yeah, like they have to, if they have the demand, then the market will change with it.
Yeah. So sustainability is a great idea, but we got to figure out how to make individuals want to be sustainable.
Right. That's what I've been thinking a lot about, is I feel like part of the reason people want to jump to making policies and stuff that add more government regulation is because, like, the few that want that are louder than, like, the majority. And I just think the problem is there's not enough people that care and want to do it. And you can't, policy isn't going to make them want to do it. It's going to maybe even go the other way about it.
Another part of that is that government regulation in general may sound, it may be intentionally benevolent. Okay, everybody may think that it's a great idea to have a policy that does A, and that may create problems for innovators, particularly small business innovators. It may, on the other hand, be very advantageous for large corporations. Some of the most strict government regulations are very much backed up, very much supported by large corporations, because large corporations know that regulations keep competition away.
Right.
Competition is kept at bay, and so corporatism is is not really any better than a centrally planned economy in some cases. Corporatism often loves regulation because it's it's a free way of not having to deal with competition.
Right. Do you think that's what, like, because I hear a lot of people, I'm not somebody that's familiar with like the farm side of things because I didn't grow up on one or anything, but I know a lot of people talk about the problems that corporate farms cause or in competition with small farms or things like that. Do you think that kind of plays into why?
Yeah, it's a very complex question. First of all farms are businesses.
Right.
They always have been businesses, at least in this country. And um, the number of farms has steadily steadily declined. If we were to go back 150 years ago, 95% of the American population were farmers.
Yeah.
Today we have about less than 2%
Crazy.
directly involved in agriculture. So, and at the same time as the number of farmers, number of farms was going down, the size of farms was going up, and that's to be expected. That means that farm production is becoming more and more efficient. So we're kind of at a point now, though, where farm production is so efficient and so large scale that it perhaps does a couple of things. It threatens the viability of agriculture in general because of the possibility of gargantuan losses, because of the losses through things like disease, breakdowns in infrastructure that we've seen with COVID-19, for example, inability to move goods and process goods at the same rate, and it causes shortages and sort of thing. Large-scale corporate use of land, in which there's no one individual responsible for what a big ag corporation does. Everybody, and we can't say that it's them versus us, because if you have a 401k or a 457b or some sort of retirement account, more than likely you're going to have your own investment in that corporation. You may not even know it. So that sort of the dispersal of responsibility, the dispersal of capital in something like a corporation means that, well, what's the goal of the corporation? The goal of the corporation is to always make a profit. It's to always be becoming more and more efficient, so that the shareholders will be satisfied. So then we have to kind of make a decision. Well, okay, maybe I can decide that I want to buy fewer goods that are produced on a corporate scale or massive global scale, and I might want to pay a higher price. And that's the way you vote. That's the way you vote, was with your pocketbook or with your feet. You can decide to purchase goods that are going to cost a little bit more, but maybe you're going to support a more local or a smaller scale operation. And I do stuff like that. But then again, I'm not. I'm also a consumer, and I have to make trade-offs, and I can't afford to do everything I would like to do. But I'll buy free-range eggs, for example. I'll spend a couple extra dollars for a dozen of free-range eggs, or I'll avoid soy products. That's one thing I definitely do. I avoid soy products for a couple of reasons. Soya is a major contributor to deforestation, and mostly deforestation in South America.
I heard that palm oil is too, but
yeah, palm oil is another great example. So don't eat, Peter Paul peanut, or Mounds and Almond Joy and all that junk that we use to create palm oil, candy and garbage like that. So there are good reasons to avoid it health-wise. If you're a man, you don't want to eat soy protein anyway.
Right.
That's the reason I originally quit. But And I quit that a long time ago. But it's also an industry that has a lot of negative impacts.
Mhm.
So there's an infinite number of individual consumer decisions that we have to make. Hopefully, we can learn a little bit about making those decisions in this course.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good idea because I only found out about something like palm oil recently, and then I just found out about soy. And if people want more like sustainable actions, they can choose to purchase things that don't support it, don't support negative
Mhm.
repercussions. So
Yeah, and you also have to be wise enough to not believe every single thing you hear without scrutinizing
right.
it, right?
Mhm.
So there's a lot of misinformation out there. So we have to kind of navigate the propaganda one way or the other.
Right.
So
Ask if this is true.
that's right. So and be critical. Be critical of the ideas that you have maybe long agreed with for some reason. Always be critical.
Mhm.
Always put them up for put them to the test. So hopefully we'll do that.
Yeah.
All right. Where are you, Alexis? Do you mind me asking your location? Are you in Stillwater?
No, I'm not in Stillwater right now. I'm in Walters. It's kind of like
Oh, great.
30 minutes from
Southwest
Lawton.
Oklahoma. Yep.
Yeah.
I love southwestern Oklahoma.
Yeah.
So is Walters in Jefferson County?
No, it's in Cotton.
Cotton County. Okay.
So it's about 20-30 minutes from Lawton, Fort
Yeah.
Sill.
Okay. To the southwest or south?
South.
So Lawton is northeast of you?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Yep.
We're
I've
only
been to
like,
Walters.
yeah. You've been here? I'm surprised.
Oh yeah, I've been there.
Nobody ever knows.
I've been to every county in the state of Oklahoma. I've been on most of the back roads of every county in the state of Oklahoma. And I've been to Walters, and I know who's the most famous son of Walters, Oklahoma.
Who's the most famous son?
Who's the well in the last 50 years?
I'm not sure, to be honest.
Okay, all right. Well, you can look that one up. All right. All right. Well, it's good to have you, Alexis. Thanks for coming by, and maybe we can. I'm going to post this discussion because we got into some nice things here.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like I said before we started taping, the exam begins Friday and it'll go through Monday at 8 o'clock in the morning. So you have basically Friday and the weekend to do it. 8 questions, short essay, based on the readings, based on video stuff, anything that you see on a posted video, whether that's me or a third party video.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe even these discussions, maybe even our discussion today would make for a good discussion. Okay, good question.
Thank you.
All right, you have a good rest of your week. Good Wednesday, and keep cool out there in Walters.
Thanks, you too.
Adios.
You are currently the only person in this conference.